Hello, and thank you very much for coming along once again. Today we're going to look at the global legacy of global empire, controlling the cognitive map, and the way we came to misconceive our role in a complex ecosystem. We're going to look particularly at the work and thought of Gillian Tett from the Financial Times in London. She's been the one who's developed the concept of controlling the cognitive map, following Noam Chomsky's manufacturing consent. And we're going to look at the important economist, Professor Herman Daly, former senior World Bank economist, the thrust of whose work has pointed out again and again that infinite growth on a finite planet is a fatal illusion. Thank you for coming along. Let's begin with the insight of Gillian Tett, captured in the film Four Horsemen. If you haven't seen the film, please make an effort to see the entire enterprise. It's actually a very solid critique made back in 2014 of our current circumstance. Let's take a look. The film begins with a quote from the American Declaration of Independence, which is actually quite revealing. All experience has shown that mankind is more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. In short, the Declaration of Independence points out that humans will often suffer under oppressive regimes rather than change their habits of thought, heart, and behavior. This is, in fact, our current circumstance.
People are awfully forgiving, or they just don't understand, what's been done to them.
We are at an epochal shift. We're at a point where the West could tip into complacent and quite well off redundancy, or we could play a decisive role in the future.
What the banks did was reprehensible. That was why there was the outrage at the greed of the bankers when we gave them money that was supposed to help them lend to others, but they decided to use that money to pay themselves bonuses. For what? For record losses?
We are governed by corporations today, often by corporations that don't have very much interest in the United States of America.
I don't know what happened, man. What happened to the United States? It went so far in the ditch. At what moment did it all go bad? Was it disco? Was it Donna Summer? Is that what killed America?
We are entering the age of consequence. A rapacious financial system, escalating organized violence, abject poverty for billions, and the looming environmental fallout are all converging at a time when governments, religion, and mainstream economists have stalled. War, conquest, famine, and death. The Four Horsemen are coming. This is not a film that sees conspiracies. It's not a film that mongers fear. It's not a film that blames bankers or politicians. It's a film that questions the systems we've created and suggests ways to reform them. Over centuries, systems have been subtly modified, manipulated, and even corrupted, often to serve the interests of the few. We have continually accepted these changes, and because man can adjust to living under virtually any conditions, the trait that's enabled us to survive is the very trait that has suppressed us.
Most societies have an elite. An elite tries to stay in power. And the ways they stay in power is not merely by controlling the means of production, to be Marxist, i.e. controlling the money, but by controlling the cognitive map, the way we think. And what really matters in that respect is not so much what is actually said in public, but is what is left undebated, unsaid.
It's worth reflecting at length on the insight of Gillian Tett on controlling the cognitive map. For centuries, gatekeepers have manipulated our cognitive map, as this film points out, following her insights.
Over centuries, systems have been subtly modified, manipulated, and even corrupted, often to serve the interests of the few. We have continually accepted these changes, and because man can adjust to living under virtually any conditions, the trait that's enabled us to survive is the very trait that has suppressed us.
Most societies have an elite. An elite tries to stay in power. And the ways they stay in power is not merely by controlling the means of production, to be Marxist, i.e. controlling the money, but by controlling the cognitive map, the way we think. And what really matters in that respect is not so much what is actually said in public, but is what is left undebated, unsaid.
For centuries, gatekeepers have manipulated our cognitive map.
Most societies have an elite. An elite tries to stay in power. And the ways they stay in power is not merely by controlling the means of production, to be Marxist, i.e. controlling the money, but by controlling the cognitive map, the way we think. And what really matters in that respect is not so much what is actually said in public, but is what is left undebated, unsaid.
What really matters is not what is said in public, but is what is left undebated, unsaid. This is the insight that Gillian has brought to the world very clearly about the control of our cognitive maps. The global legacy of global empire has to do with manipulating these cognitive maps. And we're going to look at them from the perspective of a professional economist whose biography and intellectual achievements have just been celebrated in a very important way. For decades, he's been pointing out that infinite growth on a finite planet is a fatal illusion, simply because it's not possible. Ecosystems are a subset, in our minds, of the economy. But in fact, in reality, things are just the opposite. Economies are subsets of functioning ecosystems. He's pointed this out and again, and it's been the basis of the insight that we've all taken forward in looking at a complex ecosystem. It is in his critique of the misconceptions of market economics that Herman Daly has helped the whole world, not just professional economists, but in fact the entire world. Of course, the work of Herman Daly is well known to a group of professional economists who have embraced his lifelong insights to inspire their own work. In fact, they held a tribute for the opening of the publication, that is the book launch, just this past week. A book launch that focused upon his life of learning and his teachings. But his insights reach well beyond the narrow confines of professional economics and across all nationalities. This has been widely recognized on a global basis. Back in 2014, he received the Blue Planet Prize in Tokyo, their highest award for environmental insight on a global scale. In effect, Herman Daly has provided humankind with a guidebook for designing an economics of sustainability in our finite global ecosystem. Let's look at the recent economic trends on the only life-supporting planet in the known universe.
Great empire wealth always dazzles, but beneath the surface, the unbridled desire for money, power, and material possessions means that duty and public service are replaced by leaders and citizens who scramble for the spoils.
Historically, all the signs of the demise of empire are beginning to develop. Some are more trenchant than others. This current financial and economic crisis, that sort of thing always accompanies the demise of empire.
The people of Rome were constantly being distracted by the gladiatorial events, and the politicians knew that they did this. Whenever there was unrest among the people, they had a huge event going on, and they created a new event with lots and lots of gladiators, and every day we're doing that. That is a common trait of declining empires. And so today in the United States, for example, you find a tremendous emphasis on all kinds of television programs that distract people from what's really going on. Sports is a big part of that, as it was in the gladiator times. In essence, we've been lulled into a lethargy, and we've accepted it.
Just as our sports stars today earn vast sums, so did Roman charioteers. In the 2nd century, one by the name of Gaius Apuleius Diocles amassed a fortune of 35 million sesterces in prize money, equivalent to several $1 billion today. Strangely, perhaps, there's another profession that is disproportionately hallowed as an empire declines. The Romans, the Ottomans, and the Spanish all made celebrities of their chefs.
And this again is typifying the end of an empire, where things were so great, we have this last oomph of momentum that we used to be great, and we felt great, and we don't feel it anymore. So everyone is out searching for it. Well, maybe it's in the best food, or the best clothes, or the best music, or the best movies, or a reality TV show, or another magazine. But you can never get enough of what you don't need. What you need is a strong moral conviction that is pervasive throughout the society, and integrity reigns.
There's a vast apathy. There's a vast amoralism, even a political nature to it. That is to say, there are vast numbers of people who don't give a damn. And so there's this natural, I suppose, entropy. Any living organism, which an empire is, of course, over time dies. Question is, how does it die? Does it die in a violent cascade of events, or does it die over a long period of time?
The baby boomer generation were born into this age of decadence. Perhaps unwittingly, they've broken the unspoken intergenerational contract. Through unfettered consumerism, spiraling house prices, and a desire for eternal youth, the baby boomers have squandered future generations' inheritance.
My generation, the generation right after my generation, I think we forgot that little phrase in the preamble to our Constitution, which says, and our posterity. All of a sudden it became us, period.
The baby boom generation, which I'm a part of, has gone and done the biggest misallocation of capital in the history of mankind. We have had cheap oil, or cheap energy is a better way to phrase it. We've had an abundance of ideas, and we have chosen a system and perpetuated it that is probably one of the worst ways to use the blessings that were bestowed upon us. And we are going to pay a price for that.
Human beings are inconsistent and paradoxical. We hope for peace and immortality, but continually invent new ways to destroy each other were capable of the kindest, most noble acts and the most horrific atrocities.
Human beings are complex creatures. I mean, for example, we're capable right now, at this minute, of acting in such a way as to make it likely, if not certain, that our grandchildren are going to face terrible disasters. And we're consciously acting to accelerate that likelihood, even though we all love our grandchildren. How can you be more contradictory than that?
Well, as Noam Chomsky points out, we're in real trouble here. We're in the grips of major contradictions in our worldwide contemporary culture. The contradictions are built in to the banking system, which serves to redistribute wealth from the poorest populations to those individuals and corporations who are the richest. This is a contradiction which cannot endure because it disrupts the system of its stability, has no prospect in the long run.
Well, I think if the people knew what the banking system is up to, as Henry Ford said, there would be a revolution tomorrow morning. The fact is, most people think that what a bank does is lend you money that someone else has put in the bank previously. But what a bank actually does, what a commercial bank does, is to create money from nothing and then lend it to you at interest. If I do that, if I manufacture money in my own home, it's called counterfeiting. If an accountant creates money out of nothing in the company accounts, it's called cooking the books. But if a bank does it, it's perfectly legal. And so long as you allow fraud to be legalized, then all kinds of problems are going to pop up in the economic system, which you can't do anything about.
Private banks create money out of nothing and lend it at interest. Now, that sounds absurd. When I teach sophomores, about money and banking and how banks, they never believe it. And so you have to go through it again and again. Yes, banks really do create money. They really do. Here's how it happens. And it's absurd, and they're right to doubt that could possibly be what's really going on. But it is.
Redistributes wealth from the bottom to the top of the pyramid, and thus that ever-increasing gulf between rich and poor gets bigger and bigger and bigger.
Well, when you get off the gold standard and you go into a fiat money currency, combined with a fractional reserve banking system, you end up compounding debt faster than you can ever possibly produce to support that debt. So eventually you're going to find yourself back into debt slavery. And that's what's happened in the U.S. For every dollar of GDP, for example, in the U.S., it also creates something like $5.50 worth of debt. Because this is what happens when our economy flips over and basically capsizes. And of course, the government solution now to address all the problems is basically to create more debt.
You can never get enough of a currency that doesn't work. You can print it till kingdom comes, but you can't print wealth, and you can't get yourself out of debt by making more debt. If you could print wealth, Zimbabwe would be the largest, most prosperous country on the planet. We all know it doesn't work.
Of the money in the world today, 97% of it is debt. The French philosopher Voltaire once said, "All paper money eventually returns to its intrinsic value, zero." For 3 generations, the world watched the fight between capitalism and communism. But in the 1980s, the Russian economy started to collapse. The Soviet Union capitulated, and so-called capitalism reigned supreme.
Before 1989, we had a battle between communism and the market. And in that battle, there was a sense of, let's not expose the flaws in the market economy. This is too important of a battle that you don't criticize our team while we're fighting their team. And their team, associated with authoritarianism, with a failure to deliver well-being to their society, it was very clear that if you had to choose between these two, which was better?
communism failed first for various reasons. I think it was inefficient, human rights, lack of respect, so forth. So capitalist West has been continuing in a triumphalist mode, thinking, our adversary has failed. That means we're doing everything right. Both systems are trying to do something which is fundamentally impossible, grow forever. And they're both going to fail. One failed first. Capitalism's going to fail later, or it's failing now.
America right now is in a very interesting position because in the past 200-300 years of its history, it's a culture and a country which has almost always existed on the assumption that resources could be expanded. If there was a problem, you always try to deal with it by expanding the pie. Go west, young man. Make the pie bigger so that everyone's got a bigger piece. Now it's faced in a world where possibly resources are beginning to be more constrained and where it's going to have to divide up that pie and inflict pain on people. And that's something which it is not well prepared for.
This is why looking at the global legacy of global empire is so important, because it's with the history of empire, European maritime empires in particular, since 1492, that we came to misconceive of our role in a complex ecosystem. We're needing at this point to overcome the multiple legacies of European colonialism. The real question here is, can the West survive its most cherished historical myths? And beyond that, to look at the way these enduring myths that dominate the modern world after 500 years of European colonialism are in danger of collapsing a global ecosystem. The myth of racial or cultural or religious exceptionalism, the myth of the frontier, and the ensuing illusion of economies of perpetual growth, and the myth of techno-scientific salvationism. These myths are prevalent not only in the Western world, but now in the world in general. In many respects, the biggest champions of continuous economic growth are now Eastern countries like China, Korea, Malaysia, and in fact, enclave economies like Singapore. All of them rest on this myth of techno-scientific salvationism, namely that we'll, thanks to science, come up with some technique that will enable us to get beyond what are regarded as momentary constraints, either in sources of energy or in matters of materials. This is just not so. We live on a finite planet, and we cannot photosynthesize. As a human species, we depend on other organisms that do. So there's a ratio and an upper limit on the human enterprise. Ignorance, arrogance, overshoot, and collapse are what we're witnessing on the part of the richest icons in our society. If we think who our cultural icons are, they are the billionaires. But they don't realize the extent to which the enduring myths that they're pursuing are accelerating the collapse of our civilization. Herman Daly's insights reach well beyond the narrow confines of professional economics and across all nationalities. This has been widely recognized. Many other voices have pointed to the need to move beyond denial and our comfortable quasi-religious belief in the market. People like Lester Brown have been very active on this front, and he's been a principal critic of the business as usual approach and our religious belief in economic growth. More of the same old illusions is a recipe for collective suicide, as he put it. Yet few have been as clear and consistent as Herman Daly in pointing to the end of economics and the need for a new definition of economics. It's clear from the large-scale public debate emerging around the world now that whatever else it means, sustainable development needs to be ecologically and socially sustainable, as well as economically beneficial. In fact, our entire concept of economics needs to move away from the circumscribed thinking of market-driven economics toward an economics of sustainability. In short, a steady state economics. Herman Daly published on this early on, and for this reason, environmentalists are beginning to articulate new sets of principles for environmental ethics based on understanding of steady state economics and social justice. Environmentalists are essentially ethical consequentialists in search of a deontology. And they've, in a sense, turned to Herman Daly to provide the deontology, that is, the set of rules by which we should behave in a functioning ecosystem. This they do in part because Herman has put together a collection with Kenneth Townsend of a very interesting set of essays entitled Valuing the Earth, Economics, Ecology, and Ethics. In search of the new deontology, environmentalists are, in fact, asserting that we need to devise new methods to value the Earth. Herman Daly has been in the forefront of efforts to devise these new ways of valuing, very different than the neoclassical economists, who are usually pretty good at costing the Earth. Big difference between costing the Earth and valuing the Earth. And you can see there, in a sense, the contrast between Herman Daly's approach and that of neoclassical economics. While the business community has always been good at costing the natural resources of the Earth, environmentalists are arguing that that is not enough. Costs do not cover, and some argue cannot capture, the true value of natural assets because they only represent use values to human beings, not to the system as a whole. Daly has been arguing that we need to move, in a sense, beyond the immature growth stage of our economies on a global basis to a more mature stage of the steady state. One of his first books is entitled Steady State Economics, and one of his most recent ones is called Beyond Growth. Daly was not entirely alone on the question of the fallacy of growth. In fact, systems scientists at MIT, Donella and Dennis Meadows, and their associates developed a book back in 1972 for the Club of Rome called Limits to Growth. And they concluded from a systems point of view that we were heading out of control as a global economy and a global ecosystem, with humans thinking that they were in charge of an infinitely available set of natural resources. Not so, they said. There are limits to growth. And economists on the other side of the Atlantic, at Balliol College, for example, have written about the rise and coming demise of free market fundamentalism. People like Gus Speth has written on this for years, and Kate Rayworth has written a very engaging recent book called Donut Economics, which makes it clear that at a place like Balliol, where Adam Smith went as a student, a venerable old institution in Oxford, there needs to be a new kind of assessment of economics. Yet Herman Daly went beyond all these critiques and offered ideas about how to move toward a steady state economy. His book emphasized in the title, From Uneconomic Growth to a steady state economy. We're engaged in, as he points out, uneconomic growth at this point on a massive scale, and that cannot continue. In fact, beyond neoclassical economics altogether, toward an economically and socially sustainable future, Herman Daly has joined up with John Cobb, a theologian, and he argues that we must reorganize the economy, as it says in the title, for the common good, redirecting the economy toward community, the environment, and a sustainable future. A collection of his essays makes it clear that he thinks conventional economics will lead inevitably to ecological destruction if we pursue business as usual. Members of the MIT Department of Economics opposed the publication of this book by the MIT Press. In short, there were limits to the usefulness of market economics and market metaphors in an ecosystem, Daly was pointing out, and they didn't like that. Others have emphasized this, but usually from a values-oriented humanism, as at divinity schools. A paper a while back presented calling itself Selling Pigeons in the Temple, the danger of market metaphors in an ecosystem, underscored to the theologians at Harvard Divinity School in their Center for the Study of Values in Public Life that this just cannot continue. Investment and divestment questions in a finite ecosystem pose some very interesting problems in this framework. There's a fatal fallacy of market economics on a small planet because you can't infinitely grow, therefore you can't infinitely invest in growth. How are you going to deal with ethical investment decisions that lead to collapse? As we can read on the front page of the New York Times, markets collapse, but civilizations collapse as well. That's not profitable in the long run. In fact, there is no long run for the assumption of continuous growth. Africa's current food crisis is an example of, for the world to see, of the devastation of market forces in the ecosystem. Tigray and the old narrative of catastrophe is ever present in the headlines and serves as an example of how not to undertake development. The second part of the analysis that was recently presented, we can see that the extractive colonialism and billionaire agribusiness that's being foisted upon these parts of the world lead to an unraveling of the global food system altogether. Interestingly enough, it has taken the world's leading naturalist to point out the ultimate tragedy of petro-dependent agriculture, not the economists. The economists are slow to catch on to this because their focus has been on what they call the economy and not the ecosystem. But people like Sir David Attenborough have given open and clear statements of the fact that economies are subsets of functioning ecosystems, as he did in his address to the Royal Society. Let's listen.
This has been criticized and pointed out as an inevitable impact of the politics of ownership, and in effect, the fact that none of the agricultural development schemes can, in fact, in the long run, survive in Africa because they're based on an illusion about the way ecosystems work. Sir David Attenborough has been very powerful in pointing this out, most notably in the last meeting of the Royal Society in London under the presidency of the Duke of Edinburgh, Sir David Attenborough gave a very clear restatement of the Malthusian dilemma that we all face.
There have been prophets who've warned us of this impending disaster, of course. One of the first was Thomas Malthus. His most important book, an essay of the principle of population, was published over 200 years ago in 1798. In it, he argued that the human population would increase inexorably until it was halted by what he called misery and vice. Today, for some reason, that prophecy seems to be largely ignored, or at any rate disregarded. It's true that he did not foresee the so-called Green Revolution, which greatly increased the amount of food that can be produced in any given area of arable land. And there may be other advances in our food-producing skills that we ourselves still can't foresee. But such advances only delay things. The fundamental truth that Malthus proclaimed remains the truth. There cannot be more people on this earth than can be fed.
He concluded with a summation of the Malthus point of view that made it clear the current strategies of African food production will not meet, because they cannot meet, the current projected trajectories of Africa's and the world's food needs.
Many people would like to deny that this is so. They would like to believe in that oxymoron, sustainable growth. Kenneth Boulding, President Kennedy's environmental advisor 45 years ago, said something about this. Anyone who believes in indefinite growth in anything physical on a physically finite planet, he said, is either mad or an economist.
It's not that Norman Borlaug foresaw all of these things and worked against the autonomy of African producers. He had no intention of doing that. In fact, he wanted to empower them. But by seeing the impact of what has happened to population growth since the introduction of the Green Revolution technology, and as a result of it, that is, the tripling of the global human population in a record short period of time, something that never happened before in the lifespan of one person, but now is a feature of global agriculture. The human population tripled in the lifespan of one individual born in the late 1940s. Never happened before, won't happen again. But because Norman Borlaug addressed the food problem as one of food scarcity, he forgot the larger context that food is generated in reference to populations, and therefore food and populations are intimately linked over time. And he didn't foresee the interaction of food, population, and the environment as the context in which his policies would have to function long after he died. Those are the problems that the world now confronts. And this is why there's a paradigm shift that's required in addressing these issues, a paradigm shift which he was not prepared for, but his followers at this point are going to have to confront and absorb. Humankind cannot survive future trajectories of current agricultural systems because current practices do not solve the problem of human hunger. Instead, these practices accentuate global and national income inequity and generate the basis for expanded social strife, military conflict, and the syndromes of warfare, migration, and rural income collapse. In the process, these practices effectively expand the absolute numbers of the global poor and generate hunger faster than they can meet the needs of the growing number of the world's hungry populations. A second reason is simple. Current practices deplete topsoil, destroy biodiversity, pollute air, and poison declining water supplies. All of these things are going to be needed in abundant and increasing, not decreasing, supply to provide for stable or growing agricultural production over the long term across the whole world. Thirdly, humankind cannot survive future trajectories of current agricultural systems because current practices are predicated upon an increased, not diminished, consumption of fossil fuels for the production, harvesting, transport, storage, distribution, and preparation of food supplies around the world. Thus, humanity's primary production systems, its agriculture, have come to function within a global food system that is irretrievably dependent on non-renewables. Becoming dependent on non-renewables effectively guarantees that humanity's food system will in time not be renewed. It's about as simple as it gets. For this reason, humankind cannot survive future trajectories of current agricultural systems because the increasing self-destructive character of this petro-intensive model of agriculture is based upon a futile attempt to work with the simple metaphors of market economics in a vastly more complex global ecosystem. Yes, market economics have a role to play in any agricultural system, but in the final analysis, market economics cannot provide the operative logic for any stable and functioning ecosystem because that system cannot be rigged for the principal benefit of just one of its constituent species. It collapses as a system if it's managed for the primary benefit of one of its constituent species. For this reason, and in short, the Borlaug-Gates petro-intensive agricultural strategies will not work for humankind because they cannot work within a functioning and enduring global agro-ecosystem.
It's sad to say, but it has taken the world's leading naturalists to point out the obvious facts to the economists about how petro-dependent agriculture in the long run has no future because it's not renewable. It's for this reason that Herman Daly's insights, akin to those of Sir David Attenborough, reach well beyond the narrow confines of professional economics and across all nationalities, which is why he received the Blue Planet Prize in Tokyo way back in 2014. In effect, he has provided humankind with a guidebook for designing an economics of sustainability in our finite global ecosystem upon which we are all dependent.